Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CCWA's second signature lunch of 2018. My name's Julie Exner. I'm the Vice Chair of the Columbus Council on World Affairs, and I'm a Senior Vice President at Fahlgren Mortine. In my role at Fahlgren Mortine, I lead our international strategy, connecting account teams that need global help with our global partners. We work to cultivate partnerships, understand cultural nuances and best practices, and in that regard, Fahlgren Mortine shares CCWA's mission to foster global understanding and cross-cultural competency here in the region. Today's discussion focuses on a country that has risen rapidly on the world stage and plays a pivotal role in our global economy, China. As the world's two largest economies, the trade and political relationship between the United States and China is fundamental. It's fundamental on the global landscape, and key developments in bilateral relations reverberate around the world. Just last week, President Trump rolled out new tariffs that are, at least in part, aimed at pressuring China to change its trading behavior, leading to widespread speculation about the possibility of an imminent trade war between the two countries. And as China expands its economic influence around the world, it also has been expanding its security presence in places such as Africa and Southeast Asia. As today's speaker recently noted in a media interview, as China's interests in the world grow, China feels entirely entitled to protect its people. And that's going to lead to a more interventionist China. And with presidential term limits abolished, President Xi Jinping is poised to rule the country indefinitely. To help us make sense of these recent developments and put them into longer-term context, we are delighted to welcome Dr. David Lampton, the Hyman Professor and Director of China Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he also heads SAIS China, the school's overall presence in Greater China. Having started his academic career at The Ohio State University right here in Columbus, Dr. Lampton is chairman of the Asia Foundation, former president of the National Committee on United States-China Relations, and former dean of faculty at SAIS. He is author of several books on China-U.S. relations and earned his PhD, MA, and BA degrees at Stanford. His current field research and book-length project is Roads to Chinese Power, Railroad Infrastructure, and Beijing's Quest for Influence. Before I welcome him, I'd also like to add, he's been interviewed on MTV and is currently wearing an original Jerry Garcia tie. So, feel free to ask him about that afterward. Dr. Lampton, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to Columbus. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lampton to the stage.
Well, thank you, Julie, and thank all of you for being here and this warm welcome back to Columbus. I started my career here. I remember driving down what we called Olentangy Boulevard, if I remember back 30 years ago. And as we left Ohio, we saw the sign, "The Heart of It All." And my son began to cry. So anyway, this has been a very good place to me. I couldn't be happier to be here. And I don't think this place was here at the confluence of the Scioto and the Olentangy, but it's a beautiful scene. And I was up in the Hyatt Regency. I could see all of the freeways that weren't there. It was pretty much High Street and Broad Street were the main intersections and so forth. So you've all made such tremendous progress, and the university, I think, has just made tremendous progress. So when I had the opportunity to come and both back to Ohio and the opportunity to speak with you, I took it. I didn't even, there was no discussion. I said I'd be glad to do it as long as we can find the date, and we did, and here I am, and I'm glad I came. That Honda video, my career started as an assistant professor, and of course you're fighting to publish so you don't perish in academia. Being a young professor is a pretty insecure endeavor. But you had a governor at the time, I think it's fair to say the most, I'll say popular, but certainly long-lived governor in recent Ohio history, James A. Rhodes. He was interested in China. He was going to go to China, built the first state-to-state relationship between China and the United States, Ohio-Hubei. He invested enormous efforts, but he invited a young assistant professor from Ohio State to come and talk to his cabinet, and which I did, and I was at one end of the table. It was a long table, all these distinguished people, and I started to give my 45-minute lecture on what I thought he needed to know about China, and 3 minutes into it, he went, and he said, I have a few questions. So anyway, he educated me, I think, very expeditiously in sort of policy-oriented briefings. Tell them what you need to know and don't put a lot of wrapping around the package. So in any case, I owe Governor Rhodes. That Honda video would not have been made were it not for Governor Rhodes in bringing Honda to Marysville. And I can see also, I go to Dayton. I've kept a connection in Dayton for a long time with the Kettering Foundation. And you have there the Fuyao Glass Company is a big employer. I looked on the website today. They're still looking for more employees and expanding. And so China for Ohio is not an abstraction. That's essentially, I think, one of my messages. Now, I've been asked to make a few remarks on prospects for trade and security in U.S.-China relations. And I've spent the last 40 years being an optimist about U.S.-China relations. And I think if I've made any mistake in my career, it's been underestimating what China was going to accomplish, not overestimating. And in fact, if you ask what our big national problem is now, it's us adjusting to a China that almost everybody for the last 40 years didn't quite see coming in the multidimensional, capable realm that we now find it. And I suppose my ultimate message is this should be our Sputnik moment. China is representing an enormous economic as well as strategic challenge to the United States. And I think we have to be very clear about the dimensions of what that is. So I said I'm optimistic, but there is a big but in the sentence. But the dimensions of optimism stem from several things. First of all, we are economically interdependent with China, whether we like it or not. And unless we are hypothesizing disrupting global supply chains, we are going to stay interdependent. So we have to find a way to manage this, protect our interests on the one hand, but derive the benefits from economic interdependence that we can on the other. I think we are highly motivated to do that. It won't be easy to do, but we need to do that. Secondly, if we think, as I do, that global climate change and global health issues and viruses that are incubated in Asia and around the world somehow can affect us, we've got to cooperate with China on global climate change, on global health issues, and those needs aren't going away no matter what our political relationship is. If you think about agriculture, I mean, the U.S. is a food surplus place, and quite frankly, China's middle class is requiring more meat, more grain, more feed, more everything in the agricultural domain. And of course, if you just look at a political map of the U.S., you'll find all the farm states with 2 senators, and those 2 senators in each of those farm states want to protect agricultural interests, and China is a huge importer, just $13 billion a year in soybeans just for starter, not to mention sorghum and corn and wheat and all of that. So I think that politically we have built in agriculture into our political calculation that makes us want to have good relations, or at least passably good relations there. If you look at, I grew up in the West, in California and Oregon, but Boeing aircraft, 1/6 of the Boeing aircraft rolling off the assembly lines are headed for China, most rapidly growing big nation in terms of air transport and so on. If you just think about our strategic interests, we're, just as you've been reading in this morning's paper, China's involved in the North Korean issue, and President Trump has made that his #1 security issue. Well, there's no way we're going to solve the North Korean problem, I believe, at least without China being at least helpful to some degree. So the long and the short of it is I'm optimistic because we have all these undergirding pillars to the relationship. But having said that, we are right at the moment, both sides, and this isn't just the U.S. isn't managing this well story. We, in fact, have two leaders who, in fact, I think are mobilizing their populations on a more nationalistic basis, and it's making it difficult for us to politically, economically, and strategically manage this relationship. So the overall story is there's lots to build on if you want a cooperative U.S.-China relationship, but right at the moment, both of our countries are pursuing domestic political strategies that's making it very difficult to cooperate with the other. And be clear, China's doing lots of things that are not in our national interests. So make that clear. Of course, if I was speaking in China, I would have to say, I recognize we're doing some things that aren't in your national interest. So it's a two-way street. But basically, if you ask what's going on, China has a fairly new leader, 6 years in office, Xi Jinping. And essentially, he has built his political campaign, his political brand, his legitimacy on the idea of make China great again. And if you ask for the last 50 years, what has been the Chinese Communist narrative? It has been, the imperialists invaded in the 19th century, occupied us. We had civil war fed by outsiders. We had 100 years of humiliation and treaties that were imposed on us. We didn't agree. But now China is back. We're strong. We're united. We have industry. We have a military. We can. And Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress essentially said, China is back on the center of the global stage. And what he didn't say, which every Chinese understood, is, and that's where we should be. Of course, you then have our own political dynamic, and we have the Make America Great Again. And of course, to some extent, we see ourselves having been disadvantaged in past military commitments or trade in what are seen as inequitable trade arrangements. And so we have our own kind of bones to pick with the international system, and China's right up there at the top in terms of our perception of trade relations and so forth. So I'd say the undergirding story is we have two polities now that are trying to regain the greatness that they associate with the past, or the inequities of the past overcome. And I think that's kind of the undergirding dynamic here into which all these individual issues. So in effect, it's going to be a difficult relationship to manage as long as the conversation is about what you've done to us rather than how we're benefiting from a more cooperative relationship. So while I'm an optimist and I think we have plenty to work with, it's hard for me to see how rapidly we're going to move beyond, in either society, this narrative to a more balanced kind of assessment. There have been losses in our relationship. There have been gains in this relationship. Our job is to minimize conflict, maximize benefit. I don't think either country is quite at that place in their national discussion. And frankly, if you're looking for an answer to that question, I don't have it. But I think that is really the problem. Now, into that environment, then, of course, history injects and current events inject specific issues. For the last 10 or 12 years, Taiwan has not been much of an issue in U.S.-China relations. You don't even hear that much about it now, but I would suggest that that's becoming a big issue once again. Where democratic Taiwan is becoming pressurized by China militarily. China's cutting back on tourism and trying to put the economic squeeze on Taiwan, trying to isolate Taiwan. And Taiwan's got a lot of friends in the U.S. Congress. And if you don't believe that, just go look on March 16th, passed the Taiwan Travel Act, and it passed unanimously. Can you imagine in the U.S. Congress anything passing unanimously, right? And it was basically the assertion that we should send high-level representatives to Taiwan, which has been a kind of neuralgic point, to put it mildly, with the Chinese. And the more we push on that, the more they're pushing out their navy, surveillance, putting economic pressure. So Taiwan is going to be a problem, I think, in the next 12 years that it hasn't been really for the last 12. If you think about the trade issue, we've had 8 administrations before the current administration, and basically it's almost never have we imposed any punitive tariffs outside the framework of the WTO. And now we have an administration that's pushing tariffs using also, and we can talk about it in the Q&A, all of the national security and laws that haven't been applied since the 1970s to begin to put unilateral pressure on China outside the framework of the WTO. Let me be clear, and we can talk about it more. China is very unfair in its trade practices with us in many respects. The president is right to be concerned. Administrations in the past probably should have been more concerned about that. But the long and the short of it is now we're adopting methods that you can go to the bank that the Chinese are going to respond to. And we can talk about how the Chinese might respond to these tariffs in the Q&A session if you want. Certainly with the South China Sea, essentially the Chinese view is that the South China Sea are our historic waters, and we can regulate who goes through it, and thank you very much. The U.S. Navy doesn't like that idea. And so we've got a lot of tension there where China's been paving, so to speak, paving over reefs, building airstrips, embedding military equipment there. And the United States finds that strategically very undesirable thing to be doing. On the Korean Peninsula, at the same time, China helps us in some respects with Korea by putting sanctions. China also circumvents those same sanctions by offshore transfers of oil and so forth. So what I'm really trying to say is we have a pretty, what I would call bad macro environment. Each country feels resentful about the other, has a national story about how they've been victimized, and has 2 leaders that are sort of pumping up that general orientation. And then you feed all these specific issues into that basically not very constructive frame of mind, and you end up in a situation pretty much what we have. So then you say, okay, so what's the U.S. policy response been? And I think without too much danger of refutation, we can say there's been a lot going on in cable TV lately, right? Lots of distractions. But the U.S., as all new administrations do, when they come into office, they take the first year and then they issue a series of policy statements in various areas. One area of which has been on strategic relations and defense policy, nuclear proliferation policy. All the security areas have, for the last 4 months, every month there's been a new security document. And I don't get, even in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, whatever, you're not getting too much discussion of what has really been a sea change in the U.S. strategic posture towards China. So let me just run through what the press isn't talking about because of what it is talking about. In December, the administration, like all its predecessors at the beginning, issues a national security strategy. And the national security strategy basically now says, you know, we had 9/11, we had terrorism, we had networks, we had, you know, the Al-Qaeda kind of enemy security problem. But now we face a different security problem. We're moving beyond terrorism. We're moving to big power competition. And it's specified, well, who are the 2 big powers we're worried about? Answer, China and Russia. Now, that raises lots of interesting questions, like, are China and Russia the same problem? There may be problems, but they're not the same problem. But in any case, we've moved from a world in which you're looking at diffuse networks of jihadists on various continents, but not nation-state actors. They don't have aircraft carriers and large standing armies and so forth. So we've basically changed the focus on what are we organizing ourselves to protect against, from diffuse terrorist networks to now big countries. And if you ask, well, what's that mean? Well, we just passed a new defense budget that is $80 billion bigger than the last year, and has been promised to be another $80 billion yet bigger next year. And that is because when you have big power conflict, you're talking about big budgets, big equipment, large standing armies, capable aircraft, the infrastructure of great powers you have to contend with. So this has already been programmed into our budget. Then you say, okay, that was December. What happened in January? You had the national security strategy, the first thing, that's the umbrella. Then every department has a department strategy underneath it that's supposed to relate to the national security strategy. So the National Defense Strategy came out in January. I'll say General Mattis, Defense Secretary Mattis, came over to our school, unveiled the new defense strategy of the United States. He read the unclassified version of it, and then it said, students, if you didn't understand what I just said, let me tell you what we're saying. We are no longer focusing on terrorism. Of course, we're still concerned about it, but our organizing principle is now China and Russia. Understand that. So you had that. In February, then, of course, comes along the nuclear posture review, and basically it argued as China and the Soviets, or Russians, are modernizing their nuclear forces, we have to respond to that. And so the U.S. is undertaking a massive further modernization and renewal of its nuclear forces, and developing more battle-usable kinds of nuclear forces. Now, China and Russia are both doing things that we all ought to be concerned about. I'm not even trying to say all this is unjustified. I'm just saying this is what is happening no matter what you think about it. Then we, of course, have a new person in the Trade Representative's office. We have new people in the Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary. They both believe that, in fact, we have not been nearly tough enough on China on trade, and generally speaking, they believe in the efficacy of trade tariffs and quotas on imports and so forth, things that they have judged to have been effective in dealing with Japan. So we're kind of going back to the playbook of the 1980s and 1990s to put more leverage unilaterally on China. Now, some of this is not even compatible with the World Trade Organization, but most of these pieces of legislation or actions have a national security escape clause. If the president says something's a national security, we can then use a lot of tools in our toolbox that we can't use if we don't secure that. So you'll see in the paper today, we have just got mobilized an old emergency act, I forget when it was last used, to justify controlling technology to China because it's a national security threat. You've been reading a lot about discussion of Chinese students and scholars on American campuses, and are they informal collectors for the intelligence agencies in China? So you can see trade, technology transfer, proliferation, strategic who are your security problems? This is all not going in a direction that is conducive to good trading relations. So I suppose, and I'll end because I think I want to address questions you're all interested in, but I think the ultimate question is sort of, it's my optimism. It derives from my optimism on the one hand and a mere description of what's happening on the other. And that the real question is will the compulsions that we have, the attractions, the interdependencies, the win-win kind of possibilities in this relationship, which are very real, will they outweigh this national security, I will say, drift that's in a very negative direction? And of course, we cannot answer that unilaterally. One hand can't clap. The Chinese have to begin to cooperate. And that gets me back particularly to Xi Jinping, which we could talk a lot about. But he's not a guy who necessarily wants to cooperate. He wants to make China great. And he sees the United States on the skids, quite frankly. And so my bottom line last sentence is, if we are going to be effective dealing with China, we got to get our own national act together. And that means, I think, first and foremost, economically, because the economic underpinning funds everything we want to do, whether it's defense or cooperation. So thank you for your attention. I think I've sort of sketched briefly the parameters here, but I'd be interested in your questions.
So you can see index cards on your tables. If you can write a question and hold it up, one of our staff members will come over and bring it to us, and I'll kick it off. You mentioned the tariffs, and I think that's on everybody's mind. Some have said they are inadvertently antagonizing our allies more than China, and they're going to miss the mark. You made a comment that tariffs seem to almost target our friends more than China. Can you elaborate on that comment and talk about the next moves of China and of our allies?
Well, I'd approach it from two ways, but I was serious about that comment. If you sort of said the function of punishment, if that's the way to put it, or you're trying to inflict pain on a target, you usually want to maximize the pain on the target and have as many friends in the endeavor as possible support you, right? So with that comment, I had the steel tariffs, which were going to be 25%. And if you look at the where steel imports to the United States come from, answer is China is not the first steel exporter to the United States. It's not the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, or 10th. I believe China is the 11th largest steel exporter to the United States. I may be wrong, it might be 12. But in any case, 11 or 12. China accounts for 2% of our steel imports. Much of the higher quality steel that we want comes from our friends, but all the biggest exporters of steel in the United States are our allies. And we want our allies to put pressure on China to redress a lot of the trade practices that also affect them they don't like. So my basic political, I think James Rhodes would probably think in the same way. The object of politics is to get as many friends as you can on your side to put as much pressure on the other guy so that they cave in. But what we did is the Chinese basically sat back and said, okay, impose those tariffs. And now you had the EU, you had Britain, you had Germany, you had Canada, you had all our allies putting pressure on the administration not to do it. I mean, I would have thought you'd put 25% tariffs on China and exempt, and in fact, now he's negotiating to do just that. But of course, he's antagonized our allies along the way, and it gave the Chinese a chance just to sit back and say, now, truth be told, I'm enough of an economist that I don't think tariffs is a good idea, even despite what I just said. But at least if you're trying to maximize the pressure on the other guy, you wouldn't have done that. So I guess what I was really saying is this is a really inept way to do it.
I'd like to stay on tariffs and trade for a minute. Many Americans feel that the trade deficit has led to a loss of American manufacturing jobs. Do you see this as a legitimate complaint, or are other factors like automation more to blame? And is it realistic that we could bring back manufacturing jobs from China?
Well, let me get just a couple signals where I'm headed and sort of conclusions. If you want to know basically why we have a huge trade deficit with almost everybody and why we aren't able to get a handle on it, the place an economist, I think, and there may be economists here that'll correct me, to look is at our national savings rate. The fact of the matter is we save about 2 or 3% or GDP, and consume the rest. That means we have a huge appetite to buy things as opposed to invest in the future. If you don't believe that, just look at infrastructure throughout the country, right? So until we up our savings and relatively reduce consumption, at least short-term consumption, we are going to be the biggest demander out there. On the converse, the Chinese people save 40 to 50% of their GDP. So, you know, their consumption is depressed, and they're investing it in high-speed rail systems, technology, sending kids at the rate of 350,000 out for education. In short, China's investing money in productive things, and where not all consumption is non-productive. But the point is, we need to save more, buy less. That's the core of the problem. Now, the Chinese have been better at selling to our demand than a lot of others, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But I think if you'd kind of be a dispassionate economist, you'd say the solution here isn't trying to get Beijing to behave better. That's a 15% part of it. The 80% or 85% is get Americans to save more, and you take a lot. Now, you mentioned automation, and that's another big part of it. China's even beginning to move labor-intensive manufacturing away from China to Bangladesh and Vietnam and so forth. So you've got a global supply chain. Also, we have this deficit, and we say China's a big part of it, but its imports include subcontractors all over Asia for transistors, for all the subcomponents. And China often is the producer. The producer mean they assemble all the stuff and ship it off, but a lot of that value comes from all our friends, Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so forth. So all this value is where it's exported from China. All that value gets credited to China, right? But in fact, China's not making it, it's all our friends. So when we go after China, inadvertently, we're hitting everybody that's a supplier in those global chains. So I would say the deficit is not a very good indicator. But there is a but, and I just wrote a piece in the Great Decisions series, and I had a big chart that showed the deficit. And in fact, it went bigger this year than any preceding year. So even under President Trump, it's getting worse. And I say this is a problem, and it is a problem with China because China accounts for over half our global trade deficit. And it's a problem mainly because China doesn't treat what exports we have fairly. China puts up barriers to the export of our most competitive industries. So why can't why can Alibaba come to the United States, but Amazon can't get into China, for example? Why can China open up banks here and our banks there are very constrained? Same for insurance companies and so forth. So China has got some very targeted barriers on our most competitive industries, and the Americans, I think, rightly say, we're buying everything Chinese, and yet our most competitive industries are not having fair access. And so there's this underlying demand from our economy for fairness, and the code word now is reciprocity in Washington. And everybody from Trump to me is talking about the need for China to be fair. But we're never going to get to balance with China in any future I can see. But the Chinese should treat what we are competitive in more fairly. And so, no, I don't think the trade deficit's a very good measure. There are lots of reasons for it. It's not as bad as it looks in some sense. But until China treats us fairly, I think nobody's going to look at this problem very dispassionately.
Thank you for the comprehensive answer.
Does that mean too long?
It means you were thinking deeply.
Yeah.
I want to get to some of your questions. The first one is about this week's surprise meeting.
Oh.
How does the recent meeting between Xi and Kim Jong-Un play into the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, lots of truth in advertising here, but of course we don't know what they actually said. So that's probably the single most important fact. And China is ambivalent about North Korea, and it's ambivalent about us and North Korea. And basically China wants it both ways. It would like a non-nuclear Korea, I believe that. but it also wants a buffer space, and it wants to keep North Korea as a buffer between U.S. troops and force and influence in South Korea, and will support nothing that tries to topple North Korea by force. And so you have to make a judgment, will Kim Jong-Un ever get rid of his nuclear weapons? Now, he mentioned, apparently, according to the Chinese, that he did mention to President Xi that he was willing to denuclearize. And if that's so, and it proves to be so, then we can probably give the Chinese some credit for putting enough economic pressure on Kim to do that, because I assume it's not what he wants to do, given all the money and given the fact that he now has a nuclear deterrent. And then you ask us, what if Kim, what we want? I think maybe he'd be seeking security guarantees from China. If I give up nuclear weapons, will you protect me against the Americans? And the Chinese, I don't know, I imagine they might say yes to that. But I think Xi is playing a very clever game, or let's say a sophisticated game, that's not so loaded. And that is, imagine this. President Trump and the administration are sitting in the White House saying, how can I throw $60 billion of tariffs on you? And then we're turning around and asking them to put pressure on North Korea. And I imagine when President Xi and Trump talk, there's going to be the implication, you want our help on North Korea, which is your #1 security problem, then straighten out on these tariffs. And quit pressuring us on Taiwan, which is a big problem here. So I think what Xi is sending in this meeting is, I've got clout and I may hold the key on North Korea, and you said that's your most important security. Okay, I'll help you on North Korea, but you got to lay off these tariffs, you got to quit jerking us around on Taiwan and all the things the Chinese don't like. Xi is not doing this for free, I'm sure. And so we're just going to have to see how this whole thing plays out. And then there's the $64,000 question is, does China actually have that much control over North Korea? I mean, if I was Kim Jong-un, first of all, China's near, the Americans are far. Historically, China's been a much bigger problem for Korea than the US. So, if I was Kim, I would say, maybe there's a way I can keep my nuclear weapons. Maybe I promise not to get any more. We normalize relations, we get peace, and now I can play the US and China off against each other for eternity. So I'm not even convinced that Mr. Kim's going to get rid of his nuclear weapons. But as I said, I don't know what they said. I don't know what Mr. Kim is willing to do. But I think this is really going to be interesting. That's for sure, and uncertain.
Thanks for speculating for us.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to read this. I recently returned from the Gulf, where I've seen increased Chinese investments in Oman.
Right.
$10 billion in logistics. I think this is 13,000 K from Alibaba.
Mm-hmm.
Has the Gulf found a willing partner where the USA once was?
Yes, I'm not a huge, pay as much attention as I should to China's operations in the Middle East and Central Asia. But basically, China is trying to renew its centrality in the global trade system under the sort of rubric of the Belt and Road Initiative, which are the combination of overland, Silk Road, and maritime routes that went to Africa, especially East Africa, and into the Persian Gulf. And this goes back to the 14th century. And so this is part of making China, I wasn't being facetious when I said make China great again. It explicitly goes back to the great Ming Dynasty and restoring these travel routes. And what China is doing is trying to diversify its transportation infrastructure, create export markets. It's dumping billions of dollars not only into the ground transportation units, but also ports at strategic places. And they're also opening a military base in Dubai. And so China is not only building the infrastructure, but is also beginning to deploy its military, literally on a global basis, to protect these assets. And I think you had a quote where I said that China's going to protect the Chinese people around the world, just like Americans do. Why that becomes relevant is because China's putting people all over the world in construction projects, building new cities, transportation networks. China has way over, actually nobody knows, but way over 1 million people abroad. And I remember with the Chinese general, when Iraq fell apart, there were a lot of Chinese workers in the oil fields. Same in Libya. But in Iraq, China couldn't get out its citizens because it had no airlift capability, no arrangements for emergency airlifts, even if it had the aircraft. And I remember this general saying it's unacceptable that China has to lease aircraft to save its own people from the United States. And that was China's situation. And so, and you can understand that. I mean, that's actually, so as China expands, it's not going to be Hitler going into the Sudetenland. That's not what's happening. Is China's enlarging its economic reach in the world and will want to have the capacity to defend its citizens abroad. And China's investing in many sort of, let's say, less than fully stable places. So I think that's what's happening.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions and 3 minutes, so I'm just going to ask one of them.
You've been remarkably diligent in trying to contain me.
The Trump administration's national security strategy that you mentioned cites the importance of protecting intellectual property from China and others who unfairly exploit the innovation of free societies. How serious is the problem and what can be done about it?
Well, you know, Washington is a place that operates by cliche. And sort of cliches grab the popular mind or the congressional mind and executive mind, and then everybody's talking about it. The code word for this set of things is protect the innovation base. That means that the comparative advantage of the United States is seen to be our innovative capability, that we are a uniquely organized society to innovate. And I think that's true, and land-grant universities like Ohio State are right at the core of this. China is seen, and rightly so, but I want to be very careful because I think Chinese students are a great thing, right? So what I'm saying, keep that in mind. I'm not trying to say what it might sound like. But China has stolen probably tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of American technology, often cyber-wise, corporate penetrations. And we have some obligation, incidentally, to protect our own secrets, which we haven't been so great at doing always. But nonetheless, the Chinese have done that. Also, with this huge cash buildup from its trade surplus, it's had enormous amounts of money, so straight out legal mergers and acquisitions become a way to acquire technology, and China's doing that in a bigger and bigger way. Now, we're kind of torn because it creates jobs here if they build a plant. If they just acquire the technology, take it back to China, it's a one-time deal. But now, as Chinese students, those 325,000 I'm talking about, are becoming topics of discussion, as essentially they're in our best STEM programs in major research universities. And is this a huge source of leakage of technology? And are we making short-term gains by having students here, but they go back and they build these new industries in China? The number of things to be said, but a lot of these students actually stay in the United States, some forever, and 25% of the startups out in Silicon Valley have people with Asian names attached to them. Some big fraction of that is Chinese students that then stay on, go to Silicon Valley, start startups and so forth. Now, of course, eventually they form business partnerships back in China. So, you know, the global economy circulates all this. But I guess what I would say is, just as a sort of starting place to think about, the Chinese students and scholars, which is a whole nother category, have become actually part of our innovation base. So the irony is, I don't know how you can protect our innovation base and go after Chinese students, because they there, and that's what I meant, get our house in order. If you want to, we need more kids that learn physics and biotechnology and so forth. The reason there's so much demand for foreign brains is because they are so competitive in these areas. So that's what I said, Sputnik moment, engineers. If you don't want to depend on outside talent in the STEM area, you better start generating it domestically, and we're not doing it. So if we're not doing it and we toss out the people that are doing it, I don't know where you think we are.
So, thank you.
Yeah.
That brings us to our time. How about a hand for Dr. Lampton, and then I have a... Thank you. Just a couple housekeeping items. For those of you who are not yet CCWA members, please see one of our volunteers. Membership benefits include special pricing to events like today, signature lunches. And we hope to see you all at our International Awards ceremony on May 3rd, where we will honor Columbus 2020, our International Organization of the Year, for their global impact to the Central Ohio region. And as mentioned earlier, we'll also honor the Ohio students who will be graduating from the Global Scholars Diploma program this year. Thank you all, and we're adjourned.